Hello everyone, my name is Father Brian Campbell, and I'd like to welcome you now to this second episode in the YouTube series as we talk about the faith. And today I want to talk about a tough topic that we have on our minds and experience that I don't think any of us really ever escape from, and that is experience of suffering and of death, and also of Christian hope. I was reminded about a trip I took about a year ago with a group of people from Singer Island, Florida. We took a cruise together, which was a lot of fun. And we took a cruise from the St. Lawrence River from Montreal all the way around to Nova Scotia. And we stopped in a couple cities. And one of the cities we stopped at was Halifax. And while I was in Halifax, I had the opportunity to visit the city and check out, of course, their beautiful cathedral of St. Mary's. St. Mary's was one of these old churches that has a lot of beautiful stonework and amazing stained glass windows. And I was just sitting in the pews, kind of taking it all in and relaxing and praying. And also you have to remember that when I was on this trip, I was relaxing, and so I wasn't dressed like this. I was in my civvy clothes. And a few pews behind me, I could hear a gentleman who I'm pretty sure I think was on our cruise ship. And he was remarking about the crucifix that he saw on the altar. Of course, as a priest and as a Catholic, I'm quite familiar and used to seeing that, but he wasn't. So my guess was that maybe he was a Christian of a different faith. He was remarking to his lady friend behind me how he thought it was kind of strange and even sad that Catholics would portray Jesus crucified and suffering on the cross. He wondered if we believe that Jesus is risen from the dead. So of course we believe that Jesus has risen from the dead, and I felt like going up and sharing with him the reason as to why we have the crucifix, but I just decided to let it maybe sink in for him. Perhaps it's something that he needs to think a little bit more about. And one of the things that I wanted to share with you today about is that reality of suffering and death, and as Catholic Christians, how important Jesus and his cross are to our human experience. The fact of the matter is that when you and I experience suffering and death, it really kind of hits us in the gut pretty hard. There's different things that happen in our lives. I can think of several. Perhaps we're experiencing a pain. We hurt ourselves really badly, or we were in an accident, or we have an illness of some sort. Perhaps we've experienced an argument that's caused a broken relationship with a friend or a family member. We can experience people who hurt us by unkind words, or perhaps are dishonest. We also experience abandonment, loneliness, even worse, abuse, violence, and death. And we wonder why. We wonder why do we experience these things, and what is the meaning? And that's a good question. That's a question that really has kind of haunted humanity, I think, since our very beginning. When I look at the Old Testament, I find generally two concepts, as well as in the New Testament as well, to the meaning of human suffering. Concept number one is that suffering and death is seen as a consequence of poor human decisions or bad behavior. St. Paul the Apostle affirms this concept when he writes to the church in Rome, the book of Romans, where he says that the wages of sin is death. There's a breakdown in our relationship with God, there's a breakdown in our relationship with other people, and there's even a breakdown in the integrity that we experience within ourselves, that we find ourselves, feeling guilty and empty inside. The ancient people saw sin and death as a combination factor. And so it's kind of like this. When you have the Old Testament laws, sometimes people look at those Old Testament laws and say, wow, God was really kind of harsh. And some of the rules were very harsh. That included even up to death penalties. It was sort of like the death penalty here in the United States for serious crimes, or even for the physical disciplinary laws that we find in Singapore or in places in the Middle East. So poor human decisions and bad behavior is the result of suffering and death. That's meaning number one. However, meaning number two, we see a very different side of suffering with a man named Job in the Old Testament. Now, Job is shown to be a very innocent man. He's a very blameless and a holy and upright family man. And suddenly, he finds himself experiencing a lot of trial. He loses his property, his wealth, his possessions, and even his family. He begins experiencing a lot of suffering, boils on his body, and he's wondering what this was all about. And his friends come to visit him, and they're basically saying, well, Job, since you're suffering so much, it must be a sign that you've committed a really big sin against God. What did you do? And Job's saying, I'm not aware of doing really anything. And so he wonders why he experiences this time of suffering and difficulty. And what we discover is that it's a time of trial for him. It's a time of his trial with his relationship with God, whether he will remain steadfast and faithful. Because Job does not give up in his relationship with God, he in fact discovers, after all these trials and tribulations, an unexpected blessing from God at the end of the whole ordeal. So we see that the second definition in the Old Testament is that God provides us with an opportunity to grow through our trials and suffering, so that he can bring about a greater good in our life. We don't see it right now. It's a hard thing for us to understand, but it's something that will become clearer with the passage of time. So now that we've considered these two concepts in the Old Testament, that suffering and death is due to sin and poor human behavior, and also that there's this reality of the possibility of innocent people suffering, such as Job, that kind of matches up in some extent to our human experience. You and I know that there are certain things that we do or that other people do that causes them to experience suffering, even death. But we also know, and this is the hardest part, this is what we really struggle with, why it is that innocent people, especially little children, experience some terrible and horrific sufferings, and clearly they are not to blame for. Catholic Christians believe that God gives us a rather amazing, mysterious, and unexpected answer to our suffering dilemma. We find that answer, in fact, in what that man in Halifax, Nova Scotia at St. Mary's Cathedral had difficulty looking at. And that answer is, as St. Paul would say in 1 Corinthians chapter 2, verse 2, that we proclaim Christ and Him crucified. It's not that we don't believe that Jesus has risen from the dead, but in order for us to get to that point of resurrection and the empty cross, we need to first come to grips with the reality of the crucifix, of our Lord's suffering and dying. We believe as Catholics that Jesus is not just a prophet or a guru or just a moral teacher, although we certainly believe He is a great moral teacher and a prophet, but He's much more than that. We believe that Jesus reveals God to the world. We believe that Jesus manifests that which we can't know on our own and that we're always wondering about, and He makes it clear to us in human flesh. Could God have come into the world as Zeus, the Greek god, or Thor? Could He have come with all the wealth of the world at His fingertips, with the commanding power of a Roman Caesar? Sure, why not? But that's not how He does come into the world. What we discover is that in Jesus, God chooses to come into this world as a lowly child, born in an insignificant town, born poor, and in fact, as He goes on to His ministry, He's going to be virtually homeless. Jesus will be reaching out to us during His time of public ministry here on earth, and He's going to say some things that are very interesting. He's going to say that if you and I wish to follow Him, you and I must pick up our cross. He says this in the Gospel of St. Luke chapter 9, that we must pick up our cross and follow after Him and deny ourselves. Part of the experience of celebrating the season of Lent as Catholics is that we give up certain things and we sacrifice, and that's the whole idea. In giving up certain things for Lent and making personal sacrifices, we're denying ourselves, and in a small way we're picking up our cross. But we know that the big crosses in our lives, the big crosses are those heavy sufferings that we experience inside of us. And so Jesus tells us not only to pick up our cross, but He also shows us what it means to pick up the cross by His own experience. He certainly has no sin. He's committed no fault. And yet, as He reaches out to us with healing, with miracles, and with love, He's rejected. He experiences rejection. And Jesus experiences a broken heart. Jesus experiences misunderstanding and revilement. And what it is that He has come to take on our broken world, our darkness, our suffering. He has come to take on the penalty that actually we are guilty and that we ought to owe to God that separation from God that's due to our sinfulness, Jesus takes that on himself, and he bears that himself and our whole experience to the cross. Now notice he doesn't run away from it. He doesn't explain it away. He doesn't give every answer to every dilemma. But somehow he just takes it and he grabs it and he nails it on the cross. Our experience of suffering and death is not to be an isolated experience, but through Christ, we have this deep and mysterious connection with him. And he draws us to unite with his body that is bruised and broken on the cross. He invites you and me to walk with him up to that cross and to be nailed with him, to deny ourselves and to, in a certain sense, to die with him. That, my brothers and sisters, is really the deepest meaning of redemption. That you and I can experience the power of God's salvation alive in us. And that, my brothers and sisters, comes in embracing the reality of suffering and death and the Christian hope that will lead us to resurrection. May God bless you.